Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspirational show coming right up. Our first guest today is Dr. John Bargh, and he's here today to talk to us about his new book, Before You Know It. Dr. John is the world's leading expert on the unconscious mind, and he presents groundbreaking information that has been 20 years in the making, which gives us an entirely new understanding of the hidden mental processes that secretly govern every aspect of our behavior. So let's welcome to the show Dr. John.
Thank you, Marianne. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is such a joy to have you here to talk about this topic, and gosh, your book it's filled with so much information.
Yeah, I hope so. It's meant to be fun to read, and as well as getting the science across, but it's not meant to be just about study after study. It's meant to be fun too.
Well, you definitely, have some very interesting topics, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But I have to ask you, what inspired you to start on this journey?
Well, this is something that goes back, it's almost my whole life. I was in high school, and I was taking a psychology class, and back then there was a book that was very controversial. It was very sort of frightening even, by a behaviorist named B.F. Skinner, and he wrote a book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, basically saying that we have no free will and we're basically being controlled by our environment, and we're sort of like robots or automatons. And this was a very sort of a strong statement and sort of scary to hear when I was just in high school taking psychology for the first time. And it was also the time when, in the 1970s, psychology was starting just for the first time really to study thinking and conscious mind and how much motivation and things that were before that sort of forbidden to study, thanks to people like B.F. Skinner, who just insisted there was nothing that influenced anything except the outside environment. Now suddenly we could study thought, and we could study feelings and emotions and relationships and all these things. It was like being a kid in a candy store. So I wanted to look to see to what extent, Skinner was right, and to what extent he was wrong. To what extent do we need our conscious mind to get things done, to think, feel, and behave? Because one side was saying we didn't need it at all, and the other side was saying everything was conscious and everything was intentional, but neither side really had evidence. They just assumed they were right. And so we actually started a program of research to see to what extent, the conscious mind or conscious thought and intention was necessary for all the different things that characterize daily life.
Well, and so when you started to do it sounds like you've been doing your research your whole life for this book, just about, So when you started doing the research for Before You Know It, how long did it take you from kind of beginning to end to accumulate all the great information in here?
I think like 30 years, 30 or 35 years, because, we've had this idea of the unconscious from Freud. That's the one thing everyone knows. And there was a movie a few years ago called Inside Out, this animated movie with different emotions, and they were running the control center up in the mind. And even then, when one of the little emotions did something wrong, they were thrown into this dark room, and the door was locked, and it was called the unconscious in the movie. And we all still have that idea of our unconscious mind being sort of a separate mind that has its own rules, and it's a locked door, and we can't have access to it. We don't know what's going on in there. And that's really different from what the science has, of unconscious influences has shown over the last 30 or 40 years. It's very different. We have just one mind. It can operate either consciously or unconsciously, and the same brain regions become active if it's a conscious or an unconscious process of thought or feeling or willing or whatever it is. It's the same mind in both cases, and in general, it's adaptive. It's something that is on our side that helps us accomplish what we want to. It's not something that's maladaptive and self-destructive. For one thing, as many people have pointed out, that would hardly have survived natural selection and evolution, to have a mind that was trying to do you in and trying to subvert and destroy you with these impulses like a death instinct and this kind of thing. So really it's more on our side. It's something that is supporting you and helping us. It sure helped me write the book. I used it to my advantage. And the more you find out about how these mechanisms operate, the more you're able to use them yourself to turn them into your favor and advantage, and use them to help you get what you need to get done and what you want.
I would completely agree with you. I think there's this erroneous idea that the subconscious mind is, and Inside Out, the movie, was a very good example. It is like this dark room for what most people are thinking. They don't understand how it works altogether. It's like this mysterious thing.
Yeah, and it's too bad because we still have this idea, and it's still very popular. This movie's seen by millions of people, and they still have this idea that Freud was right. But the thing about it is, Freud was a doctor at a hospital, and he was trying to help people. And he was trying to help the very people that medical science said they couldn't help. They couldn't find a physical reason for these people's illnesses and problems. And so they were really not helped at all by anybody. And at least Freud was trying to help them. He was saying, well, maybe there's a psychological cause to their physical problems, and he was trying to get at that. And so he was very well-meaning and trying to help these people who were suffering. At the same time, he insisted on generalizing his theory about what's going on with these mental patients to everybody in general, to the average human being, to human nature in general. And people doing the same research at the same time, the same kind of therapies, like Pierre Janet in Paris, disagreed strongly with Freud, saying we can't generalize to all people based on these people with problems. And yet that's what Freud did. So this is what the difference is now, and what the research is summarized in Before You Know It tries to get at, is that we now have, for the first time in human history, 30 or 40 years of actual systematic scientific research and evidence about how really the unconscious works. And we never had this before.
Mm-hmm. Well, and gosh, and you must have just had kind of been like a kid in the candy store in some ways in doing some of this research, because some of the silly and simple things that people wouldn't even consider, like a cup of hot coffee, is one of the things that really stood out in your book. And I'd love for you to share that with our listeners.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because this is a basic question of existence, really. To what extent do we have control over our own minds and our own behavior, and to what extent are we just, we don't have free will and we're just responding like robots? And this is a basic question of all existence, and I was being paid to study it. I mean, the question I had, I wanted to know the answer anyway, and I had a job where I actually could get paid for it. That's like the best kind of job there is. Mm-hmm. So we found things like this, these effects of sort of basic evolved mechanisms that are so deep that have been there for, throughout millions of years of human history, and they're still there, and they're so strong that they affect us in ways we don't realize today. Think about the plight of a little infant baby. And the little baby, all of us, when we were first born, we didn't know anything about what was going on around us, but we did have instinctive kinds of things that told us the right thing to do to keep safe. And one of the channels that's there, and it's still there today in all of us, is that if you are being held by somebody close and you're feeling their physical warmth in their body, and, for example, a baby during breastfeeding, that's a signal to the baby, even today, that, and especially today perhaps, that the person who's giving you physical warmth is somebody you can trust, somebody who's taking care of you, who's going to protect you, keep you safe from predators, going to give you food, nourishment, and keep you warm. Basically, that's what we call social warmth. When someone's a warm person, they have your interest at heart. They're not against you, and they're trying to help you, and they have your own purposes, and that's something they care about. That's a warm person. So there's a natural connection then for the infant between feeling physical warmth and thinking the person who they feel it from is on their side and they can trust. And that's very important for the infants because they don't know who they can trust. So that mechanism that connects physical warmth and social warmth is something we exploited in our study from 10 years ago, where we just had people form an impression of somebody and they read about a person, they did certain things. Everybody in our study read exactly the same thing about the exact same person, except that right before they read about that person, they either briefly held a cup of hot coffee or a cup of iced coffee. We were having their papers in our hands, and we were holding the cup of coffee, a paper cup, And we said, hold this for a second so I can get your papers. And we were getting their papers while they thank you very much. And we took it back from them and gave them the materials, the questionnaires for them to fill out. So they really didn't even think it was part of the study at all. It was on the way into the lab when they did this. Yet the people who had held the hot coffee liked the person they read about more and thought they were more trustworthy and more generous, all those socially warm kinds of characteristics. If they'd held the iced coffee, it was exactly the opposite. They didn't like that person. They thought they were less trustworthy and less generous and socially cold. So the actual physical warm or cold experience influenced how warm or cold in a social sense they thought that person was.
That's remarkable how we make these correlations where you kind of think that they really don't have anything to do with one another, but when you break it down the way that you have, it makes it easy to understand.
Yeah, these things are really, they made so much sense, and they were so adaptive and helpful to us over the millions or hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary time. And the key to understanding these is that our modern mind and modern brain, is not all that different from how it was over those, spans of years. And when we've had new things added to our mind, such as our wonderful conscious abilities and intentional abilities and controls, all those nice things we have now, it didn't get rid of the old brain, it just added to it. So those old structures and old connections, or the channel between physical warmth and feeling you can trust somebody, social warmth, those channels and those feelings are still there inside us. And we have other research showing, basic evolved needs, for example, to be physically safe or to avoid disease. And those are very adaptive and that help us survive and keep safe over the years. Those also influence things like our political attitudes or our social attitudes, things that you would think, well, that shouldn't be connected. Why should those basic evolved motivations affect things that's so abstract as our reasoned opinions about politics or society? And yet they do, because they're there at the core of our being, influencing us strongly in ways we don't realize.
Well, and so when you're doing all this research, what is one of your favorite favorite things that you discovered as you were going through this whole process?
Well, there's so many of them because I've actually put them to use in my own life, and they actually helped me write the book. So, for example, the basic fact that we tend to imitate and mimic each other without realizing it is called behavior contagion. Sort of what you see is what you do is a chapter, and before you know it, and that's a very natural thing now in social media. It's spreading all over the place because we're connected to other people we don't even know through people we do know in these electronic internet social media ways, and expanding the connectedness we are to other people in by leaps and bounds. And so the research has shown that things like obesity, depression, cooperation, happiness, all of those things are contagious through these social networks. So that if someone has those characteristics, but you don't even know them, if they're connected, like in your Facebook friends network or something, to you through people you do know, that you're more likely to have those characteristics yourself. You're more likely, if people 3 or 4 steps removed from you are obese or depressed or happy, whatever it is, you're more likely to be that way than otherwise. So we're really affected by other people. There's 2 ways that you can turn that to your advantage. One is because we also tend to like people who are imitating us. It's like a way we sort of naturally bond. Research has shown that when waitresses repeat back a person's order, they get higher tips. All they're doing is mimicking and imitating what the person just said. That's all. And yet they get significantly higher tips in a study of Dutch restaurants. Same thing happens there's a study of a French department store, the electronics section, where the sales clerk just repeated back the person's statement about why they wanted the MP3 player, or they didn't. And if they did, sales were much higher and customer satisfaction was much higher. So when we imitate others, they like us more, and they bond with us more, and we have greater liking. Well, the easy way to do this, then, is when you're meeting somebody for the first time, and they're forming an impression of you just like you are of them. Maybe it's your new next-door neighbor. Maybe it's a new colleague at work. Whoever it is, a member of your club, whatever it is, all you should do really is pay attention to them. It sounds so simple, but just look at them. Because if you pay attention to them and look at them, and that's not something we always do necessarily, then you'll naturally take on their facial expressions, their tone of voice, their body language, and they'll notice that, again, unconsciously, and they'll like you better for it. And the only trick there is just to pay attention to the other person instead of, like I do, and I'm often, forgetting people's names because I didn't pay attention in the first place when they were saying what their name was, because I was so thinking inside about what I was going to say next, something clever. I didn't want to sound stupid, and my attention was focused in on me instead of out at them. The real trick here is just pay attention and look at them, and all these natural good things happen.
Yeah, it's so interesting because a lot of people do that, where they are looking to formulate the answer in their mind, so they're not really focused in on being present in the moment and listening to what the people are saying, especially the name. I mean, that seems to be a thing with a lot of people where they forget names.
That's absolutely true. I mean, I'm really prone to that. And it's funny because you say that, just pay attention to the other person, and it's like, well, duh. Well, that's what I'm doing, right? But, that's not what you're doing. Our attention is very fragile. That's why texting or being on the phone while you're driving is so dangerous, because we really don't have that much attention. It's very easily distracted away from what's going on, and with dangerous results. So we have to be very careful with our attention and really be more in control of where it's directed.
Well, since we're talking about attention, one of the questions I have is, what are some tips? Because, gosh, we're in the holiday season now, and so what are some tips that we can do to manage our to-do list and remember it?
There's this great technique, and you write a book about unconscious influences, and a person can read all these things. My God, there's so many of these. I don't know what's going on with me. They're affecting me, and I say, well, I may not have that much free will. I'm being driven by all these effects of politicians maybe, or advertisers, or all these things carrying over from my work life to my home life, and I'm not aware of them, and so, oh no. The thing is, there are techniques, and we end the book with a chapter called You Have Mind Control, which basically says, first of all, if you know these things are operating, then you can be more aware and you can adjust for them if you want to. But the other thing is you can use them to your advantage. One thing that's very strong as far as an unconscious influence on people are things in the outside world like reminders or provocations or something. For example, if you have the goal with your mother of helping her or being cooperative or friendly with her, just thinking about your mother or seeing a photograph of her is a trigger to those kinds of things from the outside. It causes you to be temporarily more friendly, as if she was actually there. So these outside influences can trigger things inside us. You can make use of that. For example, I used to have a problem. My little girl, who's now 11, I would come home, long day at work, a lot of people wanting me to do things for them, do this, do that, read this, review something for a journal, or read a paper for a student and give the student advice. And it's like your job is doing things for other people. And I was tired, and I got home after commuting, and I come inside. My little girl runs up, to the door, Daddy, Daddy, and wants to show me all the art, all the crayon paint, all the art stuff she's done, and she wants me to see everything she's done during the day while I was away at work. And I caught myself a couple of times feeling like, oh yeah, well here's yet another person who wants my attention, who wants me to look at them and pay attention to them instead of I just want to chill for a while because I'm really tired. And I would Daddy, you'll look at this later, or I'm tired now or something, and you'd see the disappointment on her face. And I immediately say, my God, what am I doing? This is what I lived for. This is the best part of my life. Here I am, acting this way, and I felt, Dad, I wanted to stop doing it. So what I did was make what we call, and what research has shown to be so effective, an implementation intention. And it's very simple, but very profoundly powerful. And that is to specify some reliable future event that when it happens, you will do something that you want. So I say, okay, when I drive home and I get out of the car and my foot is on the pavement of my driveway, that always happens. When I drive home, I don't sit in my car in the driveway all night. I actually get out of the car, so I know that when I drive home and open the door, my foot's going to go out and stand on the pavement. I said, when my foot hits the pavement, I will remember how lucky and happy I am to be home, and how much I look forward to being home, and how happy I am to see my little girl, and I will forget everything about the work the rest of the stuff that happened during work that day. And I may have forgotten that intention. I may come home all crabby, but as soon as my foot hit that pavement, boom, it's like, yeah, I'm happy to be home. I come in, I'm happy. I pick her up. I look at everything she's done, and it never happened again. So I'm actually saying what I really want to happen, but I'm giving it under the control of the outside world. So when the outside thing happens, it triggers it in me without having to remember it. That's a great trick to remember things. They've used this with elderly patients in nursing homes who have a lot of pills to take, and found that it really dramatically increases their taking the right pill at the right time, even though it's very complicated. They have many pills to take. They've used it to increase voter turnout in primary elections. People in the Barack Obama campaign used this and significantly increased turnout at primary elections by specifying, when, where, and how I'm going to vote. Instead of just I will vote, they're saying exactly when, where, and how I'm going to do it, and making those really concrete plans and saying what exactly is going to happen out in the world that's going to trigger this important goal I have. When you do this kind of thing, it really increases you're doing the difficult things you keep forgetting to do.
It's amazing how this all comes together, because you even had some research done on the flu shot.
Yeah, this stuff really blows me away, because this is new. This is from like the last 10 years, and we've been doing all these other kinds of studies for a long time. But the flu shot, there's a very powerful need we have to avoid disease. We avoid things that are disgusting, that are contaminated, that smell bad, that are dirty. And this is so important to our survival that people don't realize. Now that we have antibiotics and we have Purell and we have ways to be clean, we didn't always have that. In fact, the American Civil War was only 150 years ago. And during the American Civil War, 60 out of every 1,000 soldiers died, not by a bayonet or a bullet, but by bacteria, by infections. 60 out of every 1,000 soldiers in that war. And that was only 150 years ago. So it's only very recent that we have abilities to combat these germs and bacteria much more than we used to. So think about the entire span of human evolution. This is an incredibly powerful need that we have, that we've evolved to have, to protect ourselves from disease and germs and viruses and so forth. So when politicians, I think knowingly, worry about people coming into our country, and they're playing on an analogy that immigrants into our country are like viruses or bacteria coming into our body. And this is something that politicians have done for 100, 200 years, is sort of to liken people from other countries coming in as if they were germs or bacteria coming into our body. And to the extent they talk about disgusting or building walls to protect us against them, or these kinds of things, it plays into this very powerful motivation we have to keep out germs and bacteria from our body. And we don't realize the effect it's having on our opinions about other people, such as immigrants. So if you want to study that, what do? What we did in our studies was to remind people about the flu virus. It was back when the H1N1 virus was rampant. It was a very dangerous one. We remind people about that, and then we had them fill out, it's important to get a flu shot. It's important to keep your hands clean. And then we had them fill out the real study, right, which was about their attitudes towards immigration. And then afterwards we found out if they'd had a flu shot or not. And it turns out that if we raise the fear or the threat of the flu, people's attitudes towards immigration became more negative if they had not had the shot. But if they had the flu shot, their attitudes towards immigration actually became more positive because we'd raised the threat that they were protected against it, so they felt safe. So this idea of being afraid or fearful of infection or disease actually causes attitudes towards immigration to become more negative. Feeling safe and protected from the disease actually causes you to have more positive attitudes towards immigration. And on the surface of it, rationally, right, it makes no sense. Why should the flu make you think any differently about immigration? And yet, unfortunately, we're falling into this powerful need we have to be safe from disease, and we're actually thinking about our fellow human beings as if they were bacteria and germs.
Well, and I think the thing to kind of help counter all this is just knowing and having the understanding that that's how some of these things link up, even though it makes, in some ways, no sense that they would.
Yeah, I mean, this is one reason I wrote Before You Know It, and that is that these influences are already known by politicians, already known by advertisers, and they're using them. So, we can pretend they don't exist and pretend that they don't have any effect on us. We're playing right into the hands of people who know they do. And, I want to be clear that sometimes I'm on being interviewed, for example, by people in sort of more conservative areas, and it's like I'm saying there's something wrong with being worried about physical safety and worried about disease, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's how we survive. It's a very important need we have to be physically safe and to survive and avoid disease. And politicians on both sides of the aisle can push us in their direction. So conservative politicians can make us feel more afraid, and that makes us tend to be more conservative in our voting and our attitudes. But liberal politicians can push us the other way, too, and make us feel more safe, try to make us feel more safe, and cause us to vote more in line with more liberal policy. So, both kinds of politicians are able to move us around, and the key is we should not let our votes and our important decisions be moved around by these states of fear or safety, because we should be voting in our self-interest or our values or what we think the good of the country is, instead of being moved around so easily with these powerful levers that people know about and use against us.
Well, and that's where your book, Before You Know It, really comes into play as far as educating people on, what are some of the things to be made aware of, because without that awareness, then how are you going to change it?
Yeah, that's one thing I'd like to do. And it's funny because I use at the end the idea that people who want to believe that they're totally in control of the way they think and act, you're entitled to that. If you want to believe that, that's fine, except there are people who are able to move you around because you're not going to believe that you can be moved around, and you actually can increase the actual free will and control you have by acknowledging that these influences can happen. If you don't acknowledge them, then you're just at the mercy of people who are using them against you. Mm-hmm.
Without a doubt. Well, and so, it kind of comes to the last question I have for us here, and I feel that especially, with, again, coming into the holidays, it's a great question. So should we not eat and then go shopping? Is that going to help us with our shopping?
Yeah. Well, hunger is another ancient drive and need we have. I mean, I saw some cartoon, I think in the New Yorker, which had a caveman reading a cookbook, and of its time, and it was basically titled "Eat and Find Some More." Because back then we didn't have ways to store and keep food. We didn't have grocery stores. We didn't have refrigerators and all that. So you basically lived hand to mouth. A lot of your energy went to finding the next meal, and it was an iffy kind of thing. So hunger and finding resources was a huge daily, almost moment-to-moment issue that we had to worry about to survive. Otherwise, we'd starve or wouldn't have shelter or whatever. So as it turns out, when you're hungry, yes, you buy more at the store. It's almost as if you think you're always going to be hungry. And so the state of hunger is like a signal. This is what your whole future is going to be like. But the interesting thing about that is you shouldn't shop for anything when you're hungry, because research has just recently shown you'll also buy more at the big box stores. You'll buy more clothes. You'll buy more electronics. You'll buy more books. You'll buy more of anything when you're hungry, and it makes no sense. Why would you buy more clipboards or buy more pens or buy more clothes if you're hungry because you can't eat them? But it's an underlying state of you need to acquire resources. You need to acquire things, including food. And when you're hungry, you just feel like you have to get more and more and more. So it's a terrible time to go grocery shopping, but it's also a terrible time to go on Amazon or online shopping or any other kind of shopping.
So it won't help get all the Christmas shopping done in one day. You're just going to buy mass amounts of something,
It's funny because my wife never buys anything for herself, and when she goes to the store, she's all about buying everything everyone else wants to eat, but not herself. I like taking her to the store when she's hungry because it's a time when she'll actually buy stuff that she wants and more than usual. So you can use this both ways. If you really want to get motivated to get all your holiday shopping done, maybe it's a good idea to be hungry when you do it, because at that time you're buying things for other people and you're giving, and it's probably a good thing.
Well, you'll be able to get that done in one foul swoop there. Just get everything done. Oh, my goodness. Well, Dr. John, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your book?
Yeah, well, I'm on Amazon under my name, but we have a website for the book, which is beforeyouKnowItBook.com.
beforeyouKnowItBook.com. Well, Dr. John, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you, Marianne, and happy holidays to you.
And to you, too. We are going to pause here for a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 1-2-3 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
Do you know that you can become a genius at any age? Do you know that you can change your life and create a brilliant life for yourself? Hi, I am Olympia LaPointe, an award-winning rocket scientist who you more than likely have seen on TED Talks, Impact Theory, and PBS. Check out my latest book, Answers Unleashed, The Science of Unleashing Your Brain's Power. Simply go to AnswersUnleashed.com books and check it out for yourself. You'll find the tools to help you create the life you've always wanted.
The highly acclaimed and newly released book, The Hand Part 2 by Lynn Van Praagh Grattan, describes the journey between a psychic medium and a family who lost a son. Messages from Beyond Eternity's Gate is of love and healing. For more information, visit www.lynnvanpraagh-grattan.com. That's www.lynnvanpraagh-grattan.com.
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. I am so delighted to be introducing our next guest, Dr. Tyra-Manning, and she's here today to talk to us about her award-winning book, Where the Water Meets the Sand. Now, Dr. Tyra defies stereotypes associated with mental illness. Those who know her as a successful school teacher and administrator are surprised to learn of her long-time battle with addiction and clinical depression, both which she faced after her husband's death in the Vietnam War. So let's welcome to the show Dr. Tyra.
Thank you.
It is such a pleasure to have you here. My goodness, your book is so well received. I mean, were you kind of expecting that when you wrote this book?
Not really. It's my first book, and so I was thrilled. I'm thrilled with the response to it. It was a book that I promised myself as a younger woman that I would one day write, because a major part of it deals with my mental illness and my depression. And I promised myself that I would one day tell this story, basically to try to diminish the stigma toward people who suffer with mental illness. But it's also a love story. It's a story of my soulmate, Larry, who was killed in Vietnam. And I wanted to honor him as well as our daughter. So it's been a thrill to have the book received as it has been.
Well, and you touched on it a little bit, and I know that your book is a memoir, and it's very heartfelt and very honest, and I applaud you in sharing the different things that you shared in regards to the book, just your personal journey in regards to dealing with mental illness and depression and different things that people go through that most people, it's like almost like a taboo topic, but we need to be having these discussions.
Absolutely. So many people at one time or another experience a mental illness or someone they love does. And as long as we keep it a secret, then it perpetuates that stigma. And I personally had such a great experience when I checked myself into the Menninger Clinic, that I wanted to share the importance of great treatment for people who suffer as well as veterans. So I'm so happy I did it, and I'm thrilled, as I said, with the response.
So why don't we start with your story a little bit at the beginning, because I know, there's so many parts that I'm excited to talk about with you. And I just wanted to kind of talk, because your husband that passed in Vietnam was a big inspiration behind this book, and actually inspiration for your title of the book as well. And so why don't you share with our listeners a little bit about just how that journey started for the two of you? Like, where did you meet?
We met at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. I grew up in far west Texas, and Larry was the son of a chief master sergeant in the Air Force. We met in October, were engaged in February, and married in May. Larry was one of those people that when I met him, it was like we were meant to be together, and we both felt that way. We still had the university to complete. He was a year older than I, and so he graduated before I did. And we worked part-time. Both of us had part-time jobs to get through school. And after he graduated, he went to officers training school. His dream was always, Marianne, to be a pilot. He wanted to fly the plane. His father was a chief master sergeant mechanic, and Larry always said that men like his dad kept the planes flying, but he wanted to fly it. It was his dream as a child. I wanted to be a teacher and maybe even a principal. My mother was a teacher, and so when he went to OTS, Officers Training School, he was then sent back to Lubbock, Texas, where there was, at that time, Reese Air Force Base for pilot training. So he did his pilot training in Lubbock, and I continued to go to college, and we both graduated. During that time, our little girl was born, and our dreams were coming true. When Larry got his orders to go to Vietnam, he was first sent to Florida to train on a two-seater forward air controller. It's a small plane that flies between as low as 50 feet above the ground to higher, and it works with special forces to bring in the special forces and drop them behind enemy lines. So it was a dangerous job. When he went to Florida, I was seeing a psychiatrist because as Larry's deployment became closer to the time for him to go, I became more depressed. And my father had died when I was a 9-year-old. Pardon me. Dad died of a heart attack when he was 36. And he was my partner as a child, and I feared so badly that Larry wouldn't come home. So that was the impetus for the beginning of that clinical depression. But Larry made arrangements for me to go to Florida with the baby to be with him during that time, and it was a great time. And my book talks about being down at the beach and the kinds of things that we got to do. Mm-hmm. In terms of the title of the book, let me step ahead just a little bit. When Larry left for Vietnam, and I was seeing a psychiatrist, and I became more depressed, my psychiatrist in Lubbock, Texas said, Tyra, if you go to the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas, you'll get better a lot faster, and the Air Force will pay for it. And I was miserable, Marianne. I could hardly get out of bed. I wasn't able to take care of my daughter. Someone else had to do that because I was so depressed. And given the opportunity to get well faster, I made the choice to go to the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas. And it was there that I really faced my diagnosis, which was a clinical depression. And I also developed a love and concern for the other patients that were there. And I'll just segue just a moment. When people read my book, or people who knew me as a principal or a school superintendent would say, oh, Tyra, you weren't like those people. Mm-hmm. And after they read my book, and I would say, oh, yes, you have to understand I was like those people. I had the credentials. The point is that many people, as we talked about in the opening, suffer from mental illness, or people they love do. And I have so many stories in my book about some wonderful, loving, and funny things that happened at the clinic. And it's a part of who I am. I know it made me more understanding as a school teacher and a principal and a superintendent of teachers, and particularly children.
Yeah. Well, and, you know, without having that kind of understanding, how else would you be able to really, you know, help the people that you're helping out? Because, I mean, you've gone through, you've completed your education, you have your doctorate.
That was a benefit, wasn't that? That was a wonderful goal. I have to tell you, while I was at the Menninger Clinic, is when I learned that Larry had been killed. And people from the Air Force came, and my psychiatrist came to my room and told me that Larry's plane had crashed. They also told me that Larry's remains had not been found, and that they weren't able, because of enemy fire, to get to them. Now, Marianne, at that time, our country, we didn't know that we were flying in Laos. But years later, I learned that Larry was flying in Laos. So it took years and years to try to find that plane and excavate the site. What's interesting is that was back in the day, Marianne, when we did not have email or texting or anything like that. So Larry would send me these cassette tapes, where he would try to fill them up. Some of them were boring, and trying to fill up 30 minutes, 15 minutes on each side. But he would send them to me at the Menninger Clinic, and I would listen to them. And he would say to me, now, Tyra, get better so you can meet me in Hawaii, where the water meets the sand. So that was, there's where the title of the book came. If I fast forward 35 years after Larry's plane crashed, myself and our daughter were contacted by the Air Force, and that crash site had been excavated, and Larry's remains were coming home. And they flew my daughter and I to Hawaii, and there's a military hotel for families there. Many of the guests there are on R&R, and the name of it is the Halakoa, and that's where they booked us, and that's where Larry and I were going to stay. So, of course, when I arrived, I went running down to the beach where the water meets the sand. So that's part of that's the major part of why the book is named why it is.
Yeah. Well, and so brave of you, again, to share your story in regards to mental illness and the different things that you're having to go through. And because, especially back, during the time of Vietnam.
1970 and 71.
Yeah.
I went to Vinegar. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There wasn't really that much discussion going on in regards to mental health as it is today.
Absolutely. And it was even more of a stigma then. It's interesting as I look back, I just wanted help. I wanted to be able to take care of our daughter, and I wanted to get to R&R,
mm-hmm.
But as I reflect now, there was and we read about, and I know veterans and families of veterans who still struggle with the effects of the Vietnam War. And then we've had so many others. There's so many similarities between military families. The thing is that loss is a big part of my book, that you can overcome it, because I know that the loss of my father at such a young age made it so much more difficult, the fear and the anxiety that Larry wouldn't come home. And we have so many children today in schools who have only one parent for one reason or the other. And it's just so important that we're sensitive to the special needs of our kids growing up. So I'm able to talk about those things and to speak to those groups, as well as to speak on behalf of treatment for people who are mentally ill, and to encourage them, if they know someone or they themselves are suffering, that they reach out and get some help, that it's a bold thing to do and not something to be ashamed of.
Well, and even for people who have depression or addictions as well, it's, a lot of times they feel the stigma like, ooh, I don't want to talk about this.
You're so right, Marianne. And in my book, I talk openly about my alcohol addiction, which after I left the Vinegar Clinic, I came to grips with. I've been sober 36 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And when I went to the Vinegar Clinic, I was bulimic, and I was also a cutter. So those are all three addictions that I overcame with great treatment and going to self-support groups. So people sometimes say to me, how could you overcome all this? I said, my story is not so different. It's different in the Vietnam piece and losing Larry and waiting all those years to keep that promise that he'd be buried at Arlington if he didn't come home. But at the same time, all of us have important stories to tell. And so my next book is in a workbook form, encouraging people to tell their stories. Because when we tell our stories, we realize that it diminishes the space between us and that we're more alike than different, and encourages others not to be afraid to reach out, I think.
Yeah. And, for people to start having the discussions around these different ailments, whether it be addiction or depression or mental illness, whatever it is, so that they can start getting treatment and start looking at how they can move things forward for themselves.
You're absolutely right. And some of those addictions are a part of their mental illness or insecurity. I'm not saying that anyone who's insecure is mentally ill. I didn't mean that. But that sometimes those issues come together in bunches or lead one to the other. In retrospect, I sort of thought, as I got better, that that I was going up the ladder of addiction, doing better and better all the time, that they were getting more acceptable. I can't believe I told you that, but
that's okay. But, it's interesting because a lot of times when we share things, it's that one piece that helps somebody move forward,
It's not, there are many, many wonderful people who have gone to self-support groups and gotten sober and do great work and have been inspirations for so many people. And when I went to the support group to stop drinking, I thought, oh my goodness, look at all these people here. This is so important, because there was never anyone in the cutting group, because I was never in a cutting group. You did that in private and secret, That's what I'm saying. And sometimes even now, as long as I've been sober and as many years as it's been since I was at Menninger, I know those experiences made me who I am, and I want to share that if it can help somebody else.
I think all discussions on these topics can help other people, and I think the world's ready to start having discussions in regards to, not just addictions and depression, because addictions are so rampant in our communities right now, but also in regards to mental illness. And, it's like how people were telling you, oh, you weren't like them. And It's like, well, we're all like them.
Absolutely.
It really is a point to kind of consider that, as a society, we have to take a look at this, because that's a portion of our society. That's not some outcast group. In a sense, they represent us as well.
Absolutely. And may I tell you a quick story that happened at the clinic?
Oh, please do.
Sort of states that. Well, I had checked myself into the Menninger Clinic, and my diagnosis after being there a while was clinical depression. Mm-hmm. And yet I didn't want to act like whatever that meant, right? Mm-hmm. So an aide was talking to me one day, and there was a beautiful pond at the Menninger Clinic down at the end of the campus, and it was surrounded by trees. So it was at the corner of the campus, and you couldn't see what was on the other side of those large shrubs and trees. So this aide and I decided, she said, would you like to just walk down to the pond and visit? There was a bench down by the pond. Mm-hmm. And I said, sure, I'd like to go for a walk. And at that time, I wasn't allowed to leave the unit without being escorted. So we got down to the pond, and we were sitting and talking. And I thought I heard a lion roar. And I thought, oh, my goodness, I must be really sick. I'm hearing these things. Mm-hmm. And then I thought I heard another zoo animal. And as we were walking back, there were more animal sounds. And she said, it must be feeding time. And I said, what? What did you mean? She said, it must be feeding time. There's a zoo across the street. And I went, oh, thank goodness. I'm not. So the reason for that story is sometimes we think there's something wrong with us and we don't want to talk about it. But talking about whatever is concerning us, it may not be a zoo across the street. It may be a reality and an experience that someone, just to hear your voice and to hear what you have to say, can help you put it in perspective. And I use that story because it did happen, and because it really is a tangible example of putting things in perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, and another thing, too, especially when we're going through difficult times, a lot of times it could feel like, if someone's going through depression or maybe mental illness, from what I understand, it could feel like, maybe they are hearing things and they're like, wow, I'm really losing it, or this can't be happening. And they're afraid to share. They're afraid to talk to people and go, hey, is that even something that you're aware of too?
I am, and that there are, sometimes we keep secrets from the people trying to help us for fear of what they'll think of us, even though they're trying to help us. And we may be paying money to a psychiatrist or to someone to help us, but we're afraid to tell them what's really going on. And without that information, it's hard. It takes longer for them to help us move forward. Also, there were people at the clinic. I don't know if you had a chance to see the book or read it, but there are people at the clinic that had really unusual behaviors, as were mine. But I loved them, and they loved me, and we had a relationship. And so many times people who are hurting or who are not doing well mentally, and they may have some unusual behaviors, or people may notice that they do, the thing is, it causes some folks to stay away from them. And that perpetuates that sense of something's wrong with me, something's wrong with me, something's wrong with me, instead of sharing it with someone you trust and love.
Yeah. They really get to a point where they're isolating themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
When what they really need to do is be more involved with the people around them.
That's why treatment centers or support groups, in my own experience, are so helpful, because there's a place where you know other people have been through some or are going through some of the same things you are, and it has a sense of safety net.
Yeah, it's at least the ability where they feel like, hey, I'm not the only person going through this difficult situation.
Absolutely. And one of the things that happened, Marianne, when Larry's remains were excavated, and my daughter and I went to Hawaii and then went back to Arlington, I failed to mention at the beginning that Larry had said, if I don't come home, I want to be buried at Arlington. And that was something in the back of my mind that bothered me all those years. When we went to Arlington to have that funeral, there were 36 men and many of their wives who were either in training with Larry or they flew out of Da Nang and flew the same planes that he did. And so there were people at that funeral, many of my former teachers, I had retired at the time, and school board members, these men who knew Larry, and some of the couples were on flight training years before. The point is that all of those different people from different walks of life came together to celebrate this one life. And I got the opportunity. I was not secretive about where I had been during that time, and the amazing support. It's the same kind of support I believe most people have. If not all people, many people, as you say, are able to reach out now about the topic of mental illness or just struggle. People struggle. If we could come forward and talk about our struggles, sometimes we wouldn't have to go down so far into becoming literally ill and alone. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we ask so much of our military and our veterans to give so much, and when they come back, we should, at least have some, I know there's some really nice resources out for them now, but it almost be something like something that's really more readily available for them. What I see more are independent nonprofit groups that are trying to fit these holes that are within that system, because they have no way to decompress when they get back.
Right. And it's also hard for their families, not because the families weren't there and they didn't experience what the veteran experienced and how difficult the situation they have been in. And at the same time, the veteran wasn't at home with the children and trying to keep the family going and those things. So those kind of resources for families are just so important. I know when I was in Topeka Public Schools, that's where I went to work before I moved to the Chicago area, and I got my doctorate at KU, but I was volunteering at the VA hospital there in Topeka. And I learned so much from those veterans. They thought that I was coming there for them, and I thought I was coming there for them, but I learned so much. They taught me so much. It's just the sharing. It's that space between us that we have our secrets and don't want to share with other people, that we find we're more alike than different.
How did you and your daughter feel when you finally got the announcement that Larry's remains had been located and was coming back?
Well, Laura was not even 2 years old when her dad was killed.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a promise that I had made to Larry before he left. And it always bothered me. I knew there was a legitimate reason I didn't know. I hadn't done it, but I felt unfinished business. For Laura, it was so important because it connected with her, with the honor and the experience, what Larry had really done, what her father had given his life for. And when she met those men and women who were in Vietnam, stationed out of Da Nang with him, mm-hmm. and the guys that were flying with him in Laos, she was able to talk with them about her dad and what he was like. And they were able to tell her about the photograph of her that he carried in his pocket and how proud he was of her. And Marianne, those kind of experiences, or those stories from those people who were there with her dad, meant so much, and still do, will always. And for me too.
Mm-hmm. It really is like connecting to another family that, in some ways, you guys had not been able to connect with until that point.
Right. Exactly. And in my book, there's a acknowledgement and a recommendation from 2 Air Force guys, and I have to tell you, when I'm describing the place in the book where Larry's plane went down and what really happened, the person who was leading that regiment helped me put that together so that I had what the Air Force had sent me, but I wanted to make sure it was accurate for people who were veterans who flew. I just wanted to make sure everything was accurate, and he helped me put it in perspective. And his reaction to being asked by me to help me do that was one of gratitude that he could do it and appreciation that someone asked.
Mm. I mean, I'm sure they really appreciate the fact that you were doing your best to make sure all the information was as accurate as possible.
It's important because it tells the story of what really happened, and they did appreciate that. I think, too, that some of them, I'll go ahead and share this, I won't use names, but some of them shared their own issues with mental illness after they returned home, and some of their own families that also had while they were gone. And, I, being self-centered, I guess, thought I was the only one. I didn't intellectually think that, but I just didn't realize how many people who are touched by service or their family members' service to our country are touched by so many separations, or when the veteran comes home or their family gets back together. They're very different, and they have to recalculate how their family works again. Yeah, they're not always because of their experiences.
I would agree with you on that. I mean, I've had family members myself that one that was in Vietnam, and it changed him completely.
Sure.
So it's interesting because I was kind of young at the time, but you hear stories of how this person used to be before and after, and the family does need to make adjustments. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The other piece that, I remember hearing this during the Vietnam War and when veterans were coming home, but I'd never personally talked to a veteran that this happened to, and they were told to take their uniforms off and not to wear the uniform when they came back to the States because of how they would be treated.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
that's
that was
the
horrible.
time we've overcome in our country. But think about those people coming home and those spouses and those families, what they were going through during that time when their veteran came home. So we're much better today in our country, I believe, and we've come a long way from that. But when we talk about the loss that I talk about in my book, some of the things that were losses were not tangible.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were the memories that were wonderful, but the memories we would never make together, we would never have together. And some of them were a tremendous sense of sadness that I felt because my father had died when I was 9 years old, that Laura would never know her father. I had to get help with that because I wanted to do everything just right, but I couldn't make up for Larry not coming home. And I'm just one example of one military family that happened to. Over the years, there have been many.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I'll share with you, I interviewed a gentleman who had been on the protesting side during Vietnam, and he's a well-known doctor now, and he was a doctor back then, but well-known doctor. And he said that, of all the things that happened during that time, that was the one thing that he wished he could have taken back was, being involved in those protests, because he said it was the wrong thing to do. And I think a lot of people look at that now and going, while we have a difference of opinion, it's kind of like, you don't shoot the messenger. Our men and women in uniform have a job to do, and they're doing what they're supposed to do. And, if we don't like something, then it's up for us to go and change policy or do what we can to change things, but not to attack them personally.
Marianne, I have to say this. I just have to share this with you. Larry made a point on the cassettes one time. I was still going to school at Texas Tech before I became hospitalized. I was trying to still keep my classes going. And Texas Tech is out in far west Texas, and I've seldom saw protesters there. But one day I was walking back from class. Larry was in Vietnam, and the baby was less than 2 years old. And there were a small group of students protesting the war. And they had some signs, not very many. But when I was trying to fill up this cassette tape, it's hard to say, think of things to say, I used these words. I said, I hate the war protesters. Well, it took a long time to get for Larry to get the tape and then to fill up a new one and answer it. But he said this to me on the cassette that he sent back. Don't hate the war protesters. He said, remember, there's a draft here. We have a draft. And not everybody who came here believed in what they were doing. And he said, I'm different. I made up my mind to be in the Air Force, and I wanted to fly the plane. So I'm here under different circumstances. And he said, we have to all come together. Now, that was back in 1970. He was a 25-year-old.
So amazingly wise before his time, really, to have that insight and to look at it that way, because it is kind of, if you really look at it, as it was, it really was kind of a mixed bag. You had people that were volunteering and signing up, and those that weren't.
I wanted to be sure I mentioned that, because when people do talk about Vietnam, because we don't have a draft now, and they hear stories about Vietnam and about protesters, one of the things that we forget is that there were many people drafted during that time. And I'm not saying protesting was right or wrong, but Larry told me before he went, when we saw some, he said, our ability to speak our mind is part of what our country is about. He was raised in an Air Force family, but I agree with him.
Yeah, I would agree with him too. I mean, it's so wise, so very wise. Well, and so now, when people pick up your book, because it is just such a profound book, and there'll be points where you'll need to have your tissue box next to reading this, but it really just pulls at your heart, and it's such an honest look at what life is like, but it offers a lot of hope as well.
Absolutely.
And so on that note of hope, what thoughts do you want to leave our listeners with?
Never give up, but reach out for help, reach out for a friend to talk to, but never give up. I have been so fortunate, but I am tenacious and I am determined. And one of the reasons is I wanted to keep those promises. Larry and I had a list of what we were going to accomplish. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to make sure that I followed those promises that we made we would do after we got married. But it's really, really important that, I've had a great life. I would give anything if Larry had been in it. But because of him, I got great treatment. And because of what he believed in and the promises, I knew, and our daughter, I knew I could go on. And other people can too. But we do need to break the stigma, and we do need to tell our stories. And we have happy stories. We don't just tell sad stories, because we forget that we have these wonderful celebrations. And it's just that we find our commonality when we share our stories. And I'm an advocate for great treatment for people. I'll go anywhere, anytime to talk about it and to speak on that behalf, because I benefited so much, and my family did. And I like to think that the children I served and the teachers I served and my opportunity to get a doctorate degree, that I did something with it, but I could have never done that without support for mental health treatment, and then people who loved me. And I've always been fortunate in having people who loved me.
Yeah. Well, so where can people connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your book?
Oh, great. My website is tyra-manning.com, lowercase letters, tyra-manning.com. And I post a blog every week on there, and also a musical blog. I love music, and so I pick a song every week and then write a blog about that song. And people can go on and say, what about you choosing this song I love? And I also do a regular blog that a lot of them focus on, excuse me, Marianne, a lot of them focus on mental health treatment, but really about life and the important stories that we all have, that make a difference in our lives. And I really encourage people there's a place to leave me a comment. I'm also on, I have a personal Facebook page, but I have an author's Facebook page, just Tyra Manning. And so I'd love to hear from the audience, from people who are listening. And I'd love to be of help if someone needs someone to speak to a group. And I love, one of the things about not being a superintendent anymore is I love this work because I get to interact with so many people.
Yeah, I'm sure, and hear so many great stories. One of the things I really enjoyed about your website was the trailer that you had that has a voice recording of Larry, and I thought that was very well done and very well put together.
Thank you. I'm so glad you mentioned the trailer on my website, and some of the other pieces there I think are interesting. But I love that one, and that recording of his voice came from one of those cassettes that I told you about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from that. Well, Tyra, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
You've been so special. you've been patient with me, and I get ahead of myself sometimes.
That's okay. You can get ahead of yourself anytime. You've got such an inspirational story. I mean, we need to hear more of this, you know?
Marianne, thank you for loving my book and for having me on. It's really special, and I really appreciate it.
Well, Dr. Tyra, we so appreciate you sharing your wisdom, your insight, and having the courage to tell your story. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.